being a magician or a sorcerer is not just knowing things. It's about being changed and developing the capacities to do things that, for lack of a better word, ordinary people can't do.
Welcome back, listeners. Today on the Glitch Bottle Podcast, we are gathering our ritual offerings of eggs and honey and heading to a three-way crossroads as we discuss the in-depth Sorcery of Hekate course with practicing magician, author, and strategic sorcerer, Mr. Jason Miller. Jason has devoted 30 years to studying practical magic in its many forms. He's the author of several tomes of magical insight, including Protection and Reversal Magick, Financial Sorcery, and many others. I would definitely encourage listeners to check out the first episode where Jason stopped by the podcast to talk about elements of magic and spellcrafting, and that was episode number 20. In this episode, however, Jason returns to the podcast to talk about a multi-month intensive magical course, the Sorcery of Hekate. This is a course that I definitely recommend having gone through it, and Jason stops by to talk about all of the intricacies and daily and long-term benefits that are built into this course. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Jason Miller. Jason Miller, thank you so much for stopping by on the Glitch Bottle Podcast again.
Oh, man. Thank you for having me.
This specific course, I've had the great opportunity and privilege to go through, the Sorcery of Hekate. And this is a course that you've developed that walks students through an entire architecture and energetic process of layering ritual and history and energy dynamics and constructions of tools and offerings. And I want to get into all that. But first, Jason, can you just share with the listeners about the Sorcery of Hekate? What is this course overall, and what was the genesis of this course?
Well, we'll start with the genesis first. I was in Nepal studying the magic of Tibetan Buddhism back in 1999. I was at a place called Pashupatinath where the dead are burned outside, and so I was meditating for 3 days under the instructions of Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, who was a lama I was living with, to meditate on impermanence. So nothing quite drives home impermanence like identifying yourself with the corpse that is literally burning in front of you over and over and over again for a few days. It drives home that concept of, you're going to die. So, make this a part of your thinking. But during this experience, sort of everything fell away, and I saw this woman walking towards me, and it didn't feel like a dakini. She identified herself as Hekate. She told me flat out that I would be returning home, by which she meant not only back to the United States, but also home to the wider world of magic. Because at that point I had spent several years just doing Tibetan stuff at the exclusion of anything else. She had said, when you do, you should go and make a supper to me on the new moon. And so a few months later, in the spring, summer 2000, I was back home. I went to a three-way Crossroads, and I set out a supper because I had talked to a friend of mine about Hekate, and sort of gave me basic ritual protocol and an old hymn to read to use as a ritual structure. And then she appeared in this very specialized form that we work with in the course, with 3 faces and 3 arms and 3 legs. And 4 other spirits appeared that are the guardians that I've written about in Protection and Reversal Magick, and which we use in this course. Thus started a teaching that it's not Hecatean Tantra or anything, but there are certain elements that are common in tantric magic that lended themselves to this, which is why I think she appeared to me in the first place. 12 years it took to get this arcana down. This was not a quick process of having a vision and writing it and teaching it. This is give a little bit, test it, work with it, share it with some others, make sure no one dies, and then getting back into it, building upon that and getting the next teaching. And sometimes the revelation leads to research, which then leads to another revelation, which then leads to more research. And as I said, testing. And so other than little dribs and drabs that I would publish here and there, twice in New Jersey, I taught parts of it live to some people, but before it was really ready. All of which I got, the kind of slap on the wrist from Hekate for sharing it prematurely. But then when it was time, it was time. And throughout the entirety of it, she would shoot down the idea of a book. Because originally, I had thought, I should record all this in a book and make a book. And she said, no, this isn't a book. This can't be transmitted as a book. Thus, the training course was born.
How did it go in terms of gathering the experiential and kind of esoteric data while you were putting this together?
It was different at different stages. I would love to say everything was just, spoken to me and written down and tested as given, but sometimes I'd sit down and really the communication would be an idea. Sometimes it would be a vision and sometimes it would be verbal. When it was an idea, then it was up to me to flesh out. What is the knowledge base that she came to me for in the first place? How do I take this idea and make it real? When it's a vision, how do I reverse engineer this into a practice? If these spirits appeared in the corners to me from here, how do we make them appear as a conjuration? It's stuff like that gives birth to this. And you test things, and the first thing is, does it work for me? And then the next thing is, does it work for other people? And over the years, I've been fortunate to have a few people to test things on, and with, I should say with more than on. And then at other times, you try it and it works and people get a good result. And eventually you just start trusting it and you start building it on. When the whole system was more or less together, I had a program called the Apprentice Program where I would have people that I would talk to individually once every 2 weeks. And one of the apprentices, I brought him through it one piece at a time. But it's very different. That taught me a lot about the system as a whole. But even then, doing it with one person was very different than producing it as a course for a lot of people. And the Q&As that come up. Of course, when we do this course, interspersed in between every lesson, there's a Q&A where I do another recording where I just answer everyone's question. And the idea here is that Hekate occasionally still responds. I still, we're about to launch into the 7th cycle. 6 cycles later, I'm still getting questions that are sort of like, that's a really good question, and I'm going to have to bring that before Hekate on the dark moon to really chew on what the answer is. These things are always developing.
One of the elements that really struck me when beginning this course, which is something we discussed last time you were on the podcast, which is people in general, and ever since you said this, I will always remember it. People love to plan things. They love to go, hey, I'm going to get a piece of paper out and I'm going to write down all of my magical goals, and I'm going to write down from 4 a.m. when I wake up to what I'm going to do at night. I'm going to plan, but they don't really do anything. And one of the things that really struck me about this program, this course, is it gets you off your ass, and it really every single day imposes upon the aspirant who really wants to benefit from the magical energies of Hekate to start immediately with mantras, and we won't get into too many details, but with specific daily efforts that just build up this base. Was that an intentional element from the beginning about this kind of direct immersion, or baptism under fire, so to speak, or was that just something that kind of developed each cycle? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, that is right from the start. This is something that is a thread that needs to be continued day to day without breaking. And if there's a breakage, then it has to be repaired. Not repaired in the way of like, oh, I'm so sorry, I've offended the spirit or the goddess, but repaired in the way that, if you drop a vase and you want to put flowers in it, you have to glue it back together. Like, the vase isn't angry at you, but if you want it to be functional, you still have to fix it. So it's a matter of magic is not just knowledge. Being a magician or a sorcerer is not just knowing things. It's about being changed and developing the capacities to do things that, for lack of a better word, ordinary people can't do. And it's not that you're born with it. I mean, some people are born with certain gifts and whatnot, but these are developed, and they're developed through work, through hard work. This idea that there's a daily commitment of mantra that you have to say 100 times, which doesn't seem like much, but it is. A lot of people, fall from it and they miss a day, and then the day stretches into a week, and then because they don't want to do the reparation. And I've done this myself. So this isn't like a criticism of people and how lazy they are, because I've fallen into that myself. I've had to do the reparations myself. Believe me, I'm not perfect when it comes to discipline by any stretch. But that is what it takes, that is the thing. And that 5 minutes is also not really getting you anywhere. That's just keeping the thread alive day to day. That's not moving you forward in the art. To move forward in the art, you really kind of need to do the whole ritual, which once you get going, you can do something meaningful in about 20 minutes or so, and longer when you have a special session, and hopefully people are doing something longer or more significant once or twice a week. But even if all you're going to do is that 5 minutes of saying the mantra, that's just staying in the game. That doesn't actually do anything for you. So it's tough. It's a work that says, look, there's a right way, there's a wrong way, and you've got to do this to stay in this game.
When you start immersing yourself, and I'd love for you to talk about this concept, Jason, of what I call layering. Can you talk about this? Because, when you start the courses, the way you organize these is so convenient, and it's so lucid, because you start out with lessons. There are groups that are set up for people to ask questions. You get back to them, which I think the feedback mechanism in this program is really, really good. But can you talk about this concept of layering? And you've kind of hinted at it just now about you start off with the mantras, and that just kind of sets the tone, literally and, not literally. And then you build upon that. That was one of the big themes of this course. Like, you build upon each of the previous lessons where you're constantly using what you had in the previous lesson. Can you talk about like this kind of layering, and why is it so important that the course is structured as it is structured?
The big element that this course does draw from Tibetan Buddhist studies, and I think why I was contacted in that place and time, is that it functions with a mandala, or a temple of Hekate, that is not just filled with you and her, but other spirits and beings and functions. And this is very similar to how mandalas of tantric deities function. So another way to think of this is as a temple that is populated not just by a god and you, but by attendant spirits. Each group of these serves a different function, and when they're all together, even though it's a group of spirits, what happens between them really almost works like a machine. It's like a machine that does magic. And so you have to start out with you and Hekate, and then you build after that initial relationship is set up. Then there are guardian spirits. They stabilize the whole thing. And then within you, there's another group of spirits that turn the volume way up on everything. If you were to do, say, those spirits before the guardians, it would cause a lot of chaos and disruption, because the guardians aren't holding down the edges. And then there's a whole lot of, we'll call it, movement added on in between all those. And so this whole astral noetic structure becomes alive and vibrating and moving in a very specific way, that it is like a machine for magic. And further spirits from there added on, further aspects, and then it gets brought into the physical through certain elements. So once you have this going on, then and only then do we start to say, okay, let's get some physical tools in here, because ultimately what's happening is something that is happening in the room that you're doing it in. Just like if you're doing an LBRP or something like that, it's affecting the room and the space that you're doing it in. It's also happening in the astral space around you, no matter where you are. So in that, there's an aspect that follows you. There's also an aspect to where you're tapping into a place that is outside of space and time, and it is essentially the mandala or Hecate's space that you're tapping into. And also this is also happening within the mind. So it is this multi-dimensional thing that happens, which sounds, a little more sci-fi than it's meant to, but that's the best description of it. It is this transvocation. It's not invocation, it's not evocation, it's both and more at the same time.
That is something that is really interesting, and you just touched on it too, Jason, about kind of the structure and the tools. And so I think one thing listeners will find if they do participate in the next cycle of this course that is interesting and fascinating is bringing in the tools not immediately. Whereas I think in a lot of the grimoire systems, there is basically you can, start acquiring tools and using tools or consecrating tools while you're learning the invocation or the evocation and while you're looking at a space here. But this, Jason, you really wanted to start with the aspirant themselves and whatever he or she is bringing to the table and kind of getting them in the game first before worrying about the tools and things like that. Would that be somewhat fair?
It is. To a certain extent, I sometimes feel that I love tools. Don't get me wrong. And we've got nifty tools in the course. So for those people who loves the arts and crafts element of it, all that is there. But an early teacher of mine once told me, with a practice that I had committed to, he said, how would you do this practice if you were put in prison tomorrow? would you still be a tantrika? Would you still be a magician? Would you still be a sorcerer? How would you do that? How would you manage that practice? And it's there you have to decide, is this something you are, or is this stuff that you own? And there's a certain way of doing magic that requires you to see and to speak and to hear and to manipulate things directly on the subtle level. And if you can't sense them, see them, or something like that, then you simply can't do the magic that way. And so this is done through establishing a daily practice, a daily and intense practice that brings you into that sphere so that you're operating within it in a real, tangible way. And then and only then can you kind of bring it down and manipulate it with the physical tools and kind of operate it that way.
There are listeners out there who are wondering, okay, so when Jason says that this is a comprehensive course, can you just kind of outline the various kinds of things that you can achieve? For example, you mentioned, and you get into this a lot in the course, but there's the devotional aspect, there's the kind of ritual offerings aspect, there's working with Hekate and various spirits for a practical aspect, there's this entire part about the various forms that are going on and the really important energies with each particular form. Again, we won't get into too many details, but what are some of the various ways that one can approach even within your Hekate course itself?
I think you answered the question by the question itself. There are all those things and more. A lot of practical magic can be done on the basis of the course. But, here's the thing. Rather than starting from ground zero, let's compare it, for instance, to an evocation where we decide we want to evoke Astaroth or Orobos or something. We would decide on doing this, we would schedule a date for doing this, and then we would do a purification period to get ready for doing this and build it up, right? And then the day would come and we would spend a lot of time perhaps repeating the conjurations over and over and over until we get a result or until we get discouraged and decide we're not getting a result tonight, and then pack it in, which anyone who has done work honestly knows happens from time to time. The big difference here is that with the daily work, with the regular aspects of this, with immersing yourself in this day to day, week to week, moon to moon, in a really intense way, that purification period, you're living in that. You don't need to do a special thing to resonate. You're living in that resonance already. When you need a spell because you've been pulled over by the cops, or you're facing difficulty or danger, or something comes up and you need something to happen then and there, or you're traveling and you don't have all your kit and you need to do a ritual that night, right? Well, now you can do something that seems short and kind of candy-assed, but it's based on the weeks and months and years of work that you're doing. So it's not. This happens too in the grimoires. This is why after you make contact, you set up ways to contact the spirit that are easier and more direct. So I don't mean to compare it, to denigrate that work, because I do that work as well. But in this way, you are immersed in that and you have access to those spirits when you need them for what you need them for.
To that point, Jason, we got a ton of listener questions. Listeners were asking about the course and specifics. Brandon is asking, I would like to know from Jason, what is the best suffumigation to reach Hekate, and what offerings are best to please Hekate? Is there any specific ancient writers that we can turn to that kind of explain more of who Hekate is as a goddess?
There's plenty of suffumigations for all-purpose deities, natron, myrrh. I use black arts formula to work with Hekate, other than some of my own that were taught to me that are included in the course. The black arts formula specifically from Lucky Mojo, but it's similar from other good retailers of conjure products. That relates to her, in my opinion, well, certainly not historically, of course. Dandelions are sacred to her. Mugwort works well with her. Be careful with burning it. But overall, questions that deal with her history, because what we're doing in the course is not historical reconstruction. I'm not interested in that in the slightest. In my opinion, the gods change, the spirits change, they move from time to time. I was having a discussion last week with somebody about demonic hierarchies, and they were really obsessed with which book is right. Like, which book has the right kings and the right presidents and this, that, and the other thing. And I had said, well, we elect people every few years. What makes you think that the hierarchy of hell remains the same? Can't they move from office to office, over time? And that idea, broke their mind for a moment. Just, what do you mean? One of these books is right. So let's let go of the questions that just deal with, the historical stuff with Hekate. I'll throw the books out that people should read. If you can get your hands on The Goddess Hekate by Steve Ronan, it's going to give you great, solid background stuff on Hekate, both in the Greco-Roman pagan stuff and in the Chaldean oracles. If you can get your hands on Hekate in Ancient Greek Religion by von Rudolph, that's going to give you a basic background in Hekate that really is hard to beat. There's another great book, Hekate Liminal Rites by Sarita D'Este and David Rankine. That is also going to be a key book in overall understanding of Hekate in history. Gets into everything from, suffumigations and offerings of eggs and honey and stuff, which we do as well. That's my favorite offering. But even gets into, what did Hekate oracles have to say about Jesus Christ? So that stuff is in there. When you get out of the Hekate-specific books, Hiera Magica, Hans Dieter Betz, Greek Magical Papyrian translation, there's lots of Difixione tablets to her, so you can look at cursed tablets and binding spells from the ancient world by Geiger. These are just a few off the top of my head as solid. If you're interested in Hekate in history, this is where you want to go. But that's not my specialty. I'm not interested in recreating her Greek cult or anything like that. Questions that are based around that, we can just say, I'm not the best guy to answer that.
To your point, Jason, maybe this next question can be answered in kind of a broad manner as well. Stephanie is asking, with several years of devotion and offerings, I noticed that Hekate is quite responsive and present, although she feels out there, in quotation marks, instead of more internal within. Any commentary on that from Jason would be helpful. So, can you talk about that, Jason? From your own experience, obviously, designing the course, do the interactions initially appear more kind of external?
Yeah, the responsiveness, I want to say she's exceptionally active at various periods in history. When you think about the change, there are a lot of people that think that she had a history in Anatolia as a slightly solar entity before she even came to Greece. And then right from the get-go, Hesiod describes her as a Titaness who, like Helios, takes the side of the Olympians. So she's older than the Olympians, but still a proper goddess. And then she stays as part of the Roman pantheon as Hekate and is honored by the Romans. And then all the way up into the 2nd century AD, she becomes part of this sort of pagan Gnosticism of the Chaldean oracles, where she becomes again this great goddess, this fully transcendent goddess or principle in between Had and Hadit, and never goes away. Even, 1,000 years later, mentioned by Shakespeare. How odd to have witches in Scotland worshipping Hekate. But she never quite goes away, ever. Her Strophilos gets mentioned by Michael Tsellis in his writings on demonology and so on. She has been popular and active wherever magicians are, wherever witches are. She is just the magical sorceress goddess par excellence. As to internal versus external, a lot of people in my courses have visions of her and things like that, and I actually spend the first 2 or 3 months telling people to ignore most of their visions and inner experiences and things like that. Stick to the work. Let them happen. Don't fight them, but don't start going off on a what does this mean tangent. Get past that introductory level of seeing. But you do get these external signs. I've had a lot of students who have had dogs suddenly just show up on their property. Other coincidences, and then of course the results, the spell results that happen with the magic that are not internal, not changes in how you feel about something, but stuff that happens.
Stephanie continues, in Mark Smith's book, Queen of Hell, he points to many other entities that help along the path, like Archangel Michael and Belial. So her question is it more typical for Hekate to send different entities along the way for teaching and helping purposes as she lights the way? Is that a common technique or strategy, or just a common thing that might be used, sending other entities along the way?
There are a lot of entities that help. I don't have anything to say on Smith's books about Hekate being related to sort of Christian demonology one way or the other. It doesn't have any resonance with the work that we do. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just not what I've seen, and it doesn't resonate at all with the history that I've seen either. And so while I do teach from Revelation, I also throw Revelation up against research to see, if there's at least a resonance between them. That said, it's fine if it's people's cup of tea, but I can't really comment on it. But Hekate does send different spirits of the dead, different kinds of night nymphs and so on, some spirits that speak for her in certain cases. Sort of the mall Santa effect that I've talked about with spirits in the past. Absolutely.
Kevin has a question, Jason, saying, this is a question for Jason more in a Buddhist framework. Do you think Hekate is a being who has moved beyond the God level and has some degree of enlightenment?
It is a very Buddhist idea that the gods are really just kind of like us. They just have extremely long lifespans and special powers and therefore seem like gods, but after a few 100,000 years, they die just like the rest of us. And of course, Buddhists would be fond of saying that, all the gods are not Buddhas. The Buddhas are Buddhas, unless, of course, they're gods that we like and have declared to be Buddhas and enlightened. And then there's arguing between Buddhist schools as to which beings are enlightened and which beings are not enlightened. And of course, all the beings for your school are enlightened, and all the beings for the school that's not yours are not enlightened, and there's a lot of politics that go into it. So I'm not going to get into the is she beyond God level. What I can tell you is this. I have asked what the final result is, because I have been asked, what is the final result? In Christianity, we have the idea of salvation. or Christ consciousness. And in Buddhism, we have the idea of Buddhahood, or at least becoming an arhat, where you become enlightened or you achieve nirvana, depending upon. So what is the final goal, I have been asked, of a Hecatean mysticism? And the answer I got back loud and clear was, I am not done yet, and you won't be in this life either. So the implication to me is that there is no end that can truly be seen, that people perhaps think they're at an end and declare themselves at an end, but yet that really just means that's where they've stopped. Not so much as where the end is. Rumi had said that about Mansur al-Hallaj, who had declared himself to be God. Rumi had said, well, he was mistaken. he got to a place and thought he was God. And so Hekate stands for this idea of going beyond. Hekate, the far off, the Hekas, the far off one. And to me, and what she has shown me, this is an ever-moving beyond what you were yesterday, and she moves beyond what she was yesterday. And so that's all I'll say. I'm not going to get into the sort of Pokemon game of how many enlightenment points does she have.
Jason, we have a question from Salem, who is asking if you could share some further comments on Apoxius, please.
Yes. So Apoxius is a spirit from this arcana that I wrote about in my first book, Protection and Reversal Magick. And what I can say is that Apoxius is just one of a group of 8 spirits whose function is about protection and, fairly fierce protection at that. Placing it in the book was sort of a way for me to help test the reality of these spirits, because while some of the spirits in the arcana are time-tested and have appeared in mythology, some spirits have not. And so when these are spirits with completely different natures than anything that has appeared anywhere else, I feel like there's an extra responsibility. Do people get results? Are the results stable? Are the results safe? So, I shared it with a few people personally and then put it in the book and was happy to report, I've never really gotten complaints about Apoxius. But beyond that, I don't have much to say beyond what's in the book. It's working with that group of spirits is a fairly advanced working in the Sorcery of Hecate. It comes as one of the last few lessons.
Listeners will definitely, if you take this course, again, going back to the concept of layering, you will definitely have an appreciation in the later lessons, for all of the previous lessons as well. And I'll just leave it at that. Jason, too, we have a question from Twitter as well. I believe the Twitter handle is Sippin' Gin and Juice, who is asking, I love the name, who is asking a 2-part question. Does Mr. Miller have any suggestions regarding offerings to the lady? And is it better to leave said offerings at a crossroads as opposed to a home shrine? So this is something I know you talk about often.
All right. Well, Mr. Sippin' on Gin and Juice obviously has his mind on his money and his money on his mind. So, I love the name. Love the name, love the song, even love the bluegrass version of it. That's very cool. But at any rate, eggs and honey is a standard. We use a specific pattern for this, but, a simple hard-boiled egg with a stick of incense in it and honey poured over it is a wonderful offering. Wine is an excellent offering. Water can be poured, pomegranate juice. These are all good offerings. Now, as to leaving an offering at a crossroad or on the altar, what I usually end up doing is actually both. In the early days, I used to do a lot of work out at sort of lonely crossroads that were more like, dirt roads. So I could be alone in the woods, and I would leave the offering right there. Then I started doing more work in the temple. And so I leave the offering for 3 days in the temple, and then I take it out and leave it at a 3-way crossroads.
Jason, you answer this question on Facebook, but for the listeners here, Hugh is asking, is your course offered at regular intervals, or do you just have to keep an eye out for when it becomes available again?
The course is offered every 7 months. So the last cycle opened in May to start in June. This one, registration opened in November to start in early December. And so the next one will open 7 months from now. Registration period is open for a month because it is, it's a big commitment for people. And so I want to give people the opportunity to figure out whether they can do it, if they can do it, when they want to do it. If they're doing a monthly payment, this way it hits on the same day every month. That's, of course, all automated. It gives people an opportunity to figure out how they want to engage in it. But yeah, it's every 7 months. There's no plan on stopping. It'll be here.
Other members of Facebook are sharing comments on your page. I know Kim's mentioning what you think you know about Hekate from reading is nothing compared to her reality. And to your point, Jason, Josie on a comment says, be dedicated, make the daily commitment, even if it's just the minimum, be prepared that she will show up. A commitment to the class is a commitment to her. And Nani is asking, what level of practitioner is suited for the course? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I just had a discussion about this. I believe, and we have had people at every single level that you can think of. I have had people come in and had this be their first serious magical venture. It really boils down to, do you want to do something meaty that takes work and effort? That's really it. A lot of this magic functions differently than how some people do magic. So they might be thinking, I have 20 years of experience, but then they come in to do this and then they have a lot to unlearn. I've had people come in and they have 20, 30 years of experience of teachers and books telling them to do whatever they think is right and to put their own stamp on it. Whereas I'm telling them, do it this way, stick to this ritual, and then they have a vision and they've had 20, 30 years of teachers that have sat on the edge of their seat to hear the student's vision and so on. Whereas I'm sort of like, well, was there something actionable there? Was there something really important? Did it tell you something you didn't know? If not, then don't accept it or reject it, but get back to doing the work. And so those kinds of things can be challenging. It's not really a matter of whether somebody is new or old. It really is just a matter of, are you willing to do the work, and are you looking for something that is worth that kind of commitment? Now that we're 6 cycles in and so many people have these kinds of things to say, like those last 2 people did who are students of the course, I can say firmly it's definitely worth it for people, because people go through and they get results.
Diana says, Gnostically speaking, the transformative nature of this course is unparalleled. I was expecting to develop and evolve in my practice, but the depth to which this has occurred is ongoing and unfathomable. She goes on, Bill says, people should know this is a fully formed system of magic and mysticism. It's deeply transformative inwardly and very potent in the world as well. It is not a historical survey of Hekate with some prayers or moon magic thrown in for fun. And that's something I can definitely attest to as well. This is certainly, and as you've touched on, Jason, it's not as historical at all. This is something that really hits at the core of getting immediately involved and immersed in an actual comprehensive system. And to that point, Jason, some random guy named Joshua Gadbois, maybe he's known by Rufus Opus, mentioned practical sorcery results versus the internal transformational results. And I think he might be drawing a distinction that is noticeable in the course. Can you just talk about kind of, is there a balance between practical sorcery results versus internal transformational results?
You know, I think I've heard of this guy somewhere along the line.
Oh, no.
See, I love this Josh Gadbois. He sounds so familiar.
Jason, you have to stop visiting the FBI's most wanted lists online.
You know, there was a really competent angel magician who went by that name, Rufus Opus, and then he went and joined the OTO and got involved with Crowley, and nobody ever heard anything really worthwhile from him again.
Oh, no. Shots fired.
I am, for those listening, just because, you know, this is a podcast and people find out about it through the internet and the internet, Josh and I are friends. So obviously I think what he has to say is worthwhile. And just to clarify about that, although I miss Angel Josh.
We all miss Angel Josh. Yes.
I miss Angel Josh instead of Thelemic Josh, but there's time left.
I'm sure we will hear from Josh as well coming up, no doubt.
You know, internal versus external, hopefully people are getting both. There are a lot of magical systems that are purely just about sorceress results. And what happens is you get people that are always trying to fix something going wrong, or they're trying to get somebody doing them wrong, or that kind of thing. And then you have other systems that are purely internal, where it's all changes in consciousness in accordance, you know. And so you have people who maybe sit around, they have big ideas and mystical insights, and then unfortunately have to go and flip burgers somewhere and, you know, interrupt their astral travels with paying. Nothing's wrong with it, you know, I mean, the economy's tough. If you got to flip burgers, you got to flip burgers. But what I'm saying is that their astral and illuminative work is not reflected in their external circumstance. And what I strive for all of my students in this course and my other courses is a mixture of both. You know, people who gain wisdom and insight and grow as people so that they use magic to affect their reality in wiser and more effective ways, so that they're not fixing things anymore after a certain stage. They're building things. And then even after they're building things, they're then, you know, kind of abiding and learning and growing things. So it's a mixture of the two. And the Hekate course has I think, provides that balance very well.
This next question touches, I think, follows that point very nicely. Nicholas, Jason, is asking, in what ways is this specific Hekate course most different from the strategic sorcery course? What's like the really big thing that sets them apart?
Okay, strategic sorcery is 52 email lessons, 1 a week. It's on general sorcery. It covers everything, and it dips you into a little bit of everything, from grimoire style work to offerings to subtle body mechanics to you name it. It also gives you access to the strategic sorcery group, which is huge. I think it's like 700, 800 people, a really productive group, people that make field reports, not just argue about magic, but then, you know, people will write in, like, I use this is what happened, this is what I got. Let's celebrate the success and or workshop why this failed, because that happens too. If you're not reporting failures, then you're probably not doing anything real. You're probably settling for too little and calling it a success. So that's the strategic sorcery course. That's sort of the introduction to my world that I tell people if they want to step beyond the books. Sorcery of Hekate is much more dedicated, much more time intensive. The lessons are audio lessons. So every week you've got about an hour on average, sometimes longer with the Q&As, where you got to listen to something. There are study guides and whatnot, but you really should listen, absorb, practice, and it has to be, whereas strategic sorcery, you can jump around in that class, do different things at different times. Hekate has to be done in a certain order to really understand it. You have to actually achieve competency in certain lessons before the other lesson can really function well for you. It's a very different class in that regard.
There's a question from Morgan Marquez who says, my question for Jason relates to me in terms of how did I change as a magician having completed the Hekate course? And I can say, just to follow that exact point, Jason, that for me, what this course gives you is a complete constellation of resonances, rituals, offerings, and this kind of beautiful layering where you can really take it in any direction that melds with your own goals while showing fidelity and devotion to Hekate and deepening your understanding there. And what was interesting to me, Jason, going through it, and I think for myself this was really kind of triggered around lesson 7, what I noticed is the system that you lay out in this Hekate course can be applied to, but also illuminated or clarified things that either didn't make as much sense to me before or invited more clarification in the grimoire system. You get this sense, something that Dr. Skinner talks about all the time is the grimoires are a broken technology, and this is all over Europe. It's a well-known fact. And so by going through your course, you get this sense that the original people who first put quill to parchment and started writing these grimoires, they came from this unbroken stratification that is reflected in the course because it's a comprehensive course. So that's definitely how I would say it's certainly changed me in a very positive way. What's some of the biggest feedback that you've gotten in all 6 now cycles of this?
I get, a mix of the sorceress results. People have reported amazing healings. One case rescuing family from homelessness. Some great stuff there. People have also reported the mystical aspects of it where they feel more clarity, more growth, an understanding of magic itself as a force. But I think the biggest thing that people get out of it is the discipline aspect of it. There's more to magic than knowing stuff or having rituals to perform. There are skills to develop and literal powers to develop and to hone that make magic so much more functional and real and powerful than, okay, well, I want to do this. Let's crack out the book and see which spirit we should contact and using what method, starting from 0 each time. Keeping a regular, disciplined, daily connection is the big thing. And I've talked to some people who, a year or 2 after the class, are not keeping with the Hekate course. They set it aside for now. And that, by the way, is also fine. I have done that at different periods during the last 18 years myself to work on other things or to shift the focus slightly in my work. I work with St. Cyprian heavily. I work with Vajrakalaya heavily, and I work with Astaroth heavily and some other spirits, as well as non-spirit related magic. But when they do, they're taking with them an idea of how am I going to approach this in a daily way? How am I going to evaluate what I get rather than just saying, oh, I got a vision, yeehaw? They're going to look at it and say, well, what does this really mean? What does this really say? Is it important, or is it just, bullshit that makes me feel happy that I got something? And so I think the biggest takeaway is it changes their view of how magic is supposed to work and how they're supposed to evaluate their own practice.
Is there anything, Jason, about this specific course with Hekate that we haven't talked about so far that you really want to emphasize to listeners, or is there any other information about the course, the kind of kinetics of the course, or the results of the course that you want people to know about?
I don't want people to be shocked at the end. There is actually a second Hekate course that continues on from this one. This one sets up the basic practice, so it is complete in and of itself. And then there's another 6-month course, if people want to take it, optional, that is based more on what you can do from here and builds upon that foundation of the first course. And then there's actually a society for people who have completed both sections that doesn't cost anything that people can join. So it's not a magical order. There's no robes or titles or anything. But I thought it would be an interesting idea, rather than having a group where people join and then learn stuff, let's have people learn stuff and then join a group. So, that is still sort of getting off the ground, and also optional. The knowledge is the reward. I don't want people to think like there's an endless cycle, there's always going to be something else to join. No, there's just these 2 stages, and even then the first stage is complete and functional on its own. You don't need the second stage to utilize the first stage. I wouldn't do that to you. And other than that, no, I put up different payment options so people can set it up weekly, monthly, in full, all at once, however they want to do it. And go to strategicsorcery.net and look under the courses and Sorcery of Hecate, or just follow my blog, Strategic Sorcery. And whenever it's open, I'll be posting about it all month.
Jason Miller, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, and we really look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you so much.
Listeners, thank you so much for checking out the podcast and for enjoying, hopefully, this chat with Jason as much as I did, and hopefully learning a ton about Hekate and this course. There are links in the video description to check out more, and of course, you, yes, that is you, the listener, right now. You are awesome, and I truly appreciate you enjoying each episode and all of the great comments that you offer, as well as suggestions and interest with the podcast. And as always, you can subscribe to the Glitch Bottle podcast on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle. And Glitch Bottle is also on iTunes, on Spotify, on Stitcher Radio, and you can download all of the episodes on Spreaker.com. There are some more great guests and announcements that are coming soon, so make sure, listeners, to stay tuned for more in the coming weeks. And as always, this episode is dedicated to you, the listener, wherever you are, in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or other haunts of the esoterically awesome. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.